So we're going to get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I'm Tori Curbelo, the Director of Education, Training, and Advocacy at LifeWay Network. Thank you for giving yourself this time to deepen your knowledge on human trafficking and deepen your commitment to LifeWay's work. Many of you are long-term supporters of LifeWay Network, so welcome back to our Lunch and Learns, and welcome to those of you who are new. LifeWay Network hosts these quarterly Lunch and Learns for the public to support you stay abreast on human trafficking. So feel free, as I mentioned before, to introduce yourself in the chat. A reminder to put any questions that you have in the Q&A function so that I don't miss them. I'll do my best to answer them, especially at the end of the session. And you might be wondering, since we are more than a year out of the pandemic, how it has affected LifeWay's work and human trafficking generally. Since some time has passed, we're in a better position to speak on it than we were when it first started. So I'll use the small time that we have together to provide some updates and general insight from the team and leadership. If at any point my internet does cut off for any reason, you never know what could happen, just stay on. I'll be right on in a second. So hope you have a cup of coffee, your lunch, your tea, and just sit back and enjoy. Okay, so let's go back to a time that we're all way too familiar with. It's March 2020. LifeWay Network has residents residing in the safe house. Governor Andrew Cuomo has announced that we must all shelter in place. Imagine you're the executive director or you're the safe house program director. So from this perspective, what might you even do? Keep in mind that LifeWay is a congregate setting. It's a community living environment, meaning that the women share communal spaces such as kitchens, bathroom, common rooms. They typically have community dinners once a week. They do activities with one another. And during the day, many of them have jobs and are in school and then return to the house afterwards. So sometimes in times of crisis, we tend to panic, right? That's when all of the learnings just go out the window, from trauma-informed care to cultural competency to de-escalation. And other trainings can just go out the window as well. But you don't want just everything to fall apart. If there's a lack of internal cohesion, those who you serve can easily pick up on that. And it's supposed to be a safe house environment after all. So the women should feel that they are in good hands. Okay. So before I begin with how the pandemic impacted LifeWay specifically, it's probably worth sharing generally how the pandemic affected human trafficking overall. I remember just a few weeks into the pandemic, journalists and supporters had reached out to inquire about human trafficking and what we were seeing on the ground, so to speak. For context, due to the underground nature of human trafficking, it is really difficult to obtain good data on human trafficking generally. Good data requires time to collect information, to analyze it. It relies on agreed upon definitions for measuring variables and uniformed ways of collecting information. Furthermore, victims, for a variety of reasons, don't necessarily always come forward. Professionals have limited capacity to detect human trafficking, and the crime is illegal. So as a result, the existing data that we have on human trafficking, even prior to the pandemic, was really hard to obtain and even to trust where we did have data. But it's even harder to know if human trafficking has increased from the pandemic a few weeks in or a few months in. So at the time, I just informed those who were asking me of the truth, which is that it was hard to say so close to the pandemic what we were seeing. So for instance, let's say that depression developed over time. That's not something you're going to see in a matter of a few days. It will take a little bit longer than that. But however, we were able to speak to historical precedent We had some concerns. Generally, we could speak to that and just generally what we were seeing, but just with that caveat. In fact, some of these concerns I actually highlighted very early on in a blog post that we put out in March 2020. So here are some of the predictions and concerns that we had very early on. Okay. The first pertained to youth in the digital space. As stay-at-home orders meant that youth would be online every day for both education and leisure, we also knew that exploiters and traffickers know that too. So those are the same exact spaces that they frequent purposely. And according to a 2018 report, 55% of human trafficking survivors met their traffickers via a text, website, or an app. So we anticipated that more vigilance would be needed to protect youth from online exploitation. In fact, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reported in October that online child sexual exploitation had doubled from 2019. And we decided as a result to support the Earn It Act, which aims to protect children in the digital space. I'll talk more about that in a few slides from now and how you can actually support that as well. We were also concerned about domestic violence and intimate partner violence, which I'll refer to as DV and IPV. A common misconception is that trafficking is done by complete strangers, when in reality, it is often someone that the person knows. It could be someone in the family, an intimate partner. And there is certainly a marked overlap in the pattern of behaviors that abusers and traffickers use to exert power and control over the victim. Sometimes trafficked individuals live with their trafficker and are subjected to physical violence, emotional manipulation, and overbearing control that are hallmarks of domestic violence. And unfortunately, there is some evidence to support that DV and IPV certainly went up. In fact, one study from the Journal of Radiology looked at scans from the beginning of the pandemic and compared it to the year before. They had an increase in wounds that they would describe as being either superficial or from serious abuse. Also, according to the American Journal of Emergency Medicine and the United Nations group UN Women, when the pandemic began, incidences of domestic violence increased from 300% in Hubei, China, from 25% in Argentina, 30% in Cyprus, 33% in Singapore, and 50% in Brazil, showing the global impact. We also had concerns about the job market generally, even for LifeWay survivors, many of whom have jobs. The concern is one, that they might lose their job, but also understanding that exploitation can fall on a continuum. With economic conditions worsening, we feared that the pressure faced by employers could become further exploitative, right? So 2 examples of incidences that aren't trafficking, but are concerning are one, the agriculture field, which is one of the top labor trafficking industries in the United States. And the reality is the conditions that they work and operate in are very harsh. They tend to live in very overcrowded spaces, travel in overcrowded transportation. So there's no social distancing there. And also during the pandemic, some major fashion brands actually refused to pay for orders that had already been completed. And with a lot of advocacy, more and more groups have actually committed to paying that, but it took a lot of work, and some groups and companies have actually not paid. And I think the question is, yes, that's not trafficking in itself, but what happens to those garment workers? What kinds of opportunities will they pursue? What kind of opportunities will they be targeted for? These are just some examples of concerns in regard to employment. And then just overall, human trafficking has seemed to go up. There's some indications of that, however. So one example is from Polaris Project, which runs the human trafficking hotline. They reported an overall 40% increase in calls compared to the year before for a certain period. And then according to CAST, which is a human trafficking organization based in California, they had seen 185% increase in homeless cases. So that's quite significant. Okay, so what did we see at LifeWay? Did we see a huge uptake in intakes at the start of the peak of the pandemic? So not exactly, and I'll explain why. Keep in mind, LifeWay isn't a hotline where someone can just quickly call and report something suspicious. We're not law enforcement handling a suspected case. Before coming to LifeWay, a survivor would first need to meet with a case management organization and then second be referred to our services. So taking this step is not by any means an instant decision made by a survivor, but more of a process. It can be difficult to seek such help and take that step after a compelling trafficking situation. And although we had space for emergency beds, our specialty really is in long-term communal housing. So unless you have an emergency, if you're a survivor and a pandemic hits, you're thinking about different things such as your job, your kids, your finances. You might just stay where you are and not take a huge leap. You might be even too scared to do so. And yeah, I think fear plays a lot into that, right? So if you're even in a very, very, very exploitative trafficked situation where you're paid very little, you're harassed, that's your focus, and you may not want to go on that journey quite yet when a pandemic has just hit and you're thinking about all these other factors. So instead of seeing an uptake in the peak of the pandemic, now is when we're starting to see more intakes, and we expect much more to come in. Second of all, another reason for what we're seeing, we have a pretty good insight onto it because we have great relationships with, in fact, we have formal relationships and MOUs, which are memorandums of understanding, with many trafficking organizations in New York. And they actually communicated to us, because we have to be in communication to keep the partnerships going, that this wasn't the first place that they would make a referral to, because we have a community setting. So it doesn't make a lot of sense right then and there. So now again is when they're starting to refer back to LifeWay Network. So I'm going to show a brief video that touches on, I'm going to show two videos today. So the first is actually in the beginning of the pandemic, and I was interviewed and gave some of my insights at the time.
As billions of people shuttered their doors to avoid COVID-19, another virus was growing.
Human trafficking and exploitation is increasing during pandemic.
This warning released by the international Catholic relief organization Caritas.
Already, human trafficking victims are exploited because of vulnerabilities, and situations like pandemic just exacerbate those vulnerabilities.
Tori Curbelo works for LifeWay Network, a Brooklyn and Queens-based group that fights human trafficking by providing housing for victims and education for the public. She says the U.S. has also seen an increase in crisis trafficking situations, up 40% after shelter-in-place orders were started. These numbers pulled from the U.S. trafficking hotline.
All the attention to this pandemic diverted somehow government and institutions' attention on other, we can call it collateral damages.
As Marta Petrocio with Caritas explains, that includes migrant workers, many of them undocumented, children experiencing violence and forced labor, and victims being trafficked for sexual exploitation. There's a lot of reasons for the surge: housing and job instability, a lack of freedom and ability to get out of a bad situation because of the lockdown and travel restrictions, and an increase in online child exploitation as children and predators use the internet more. A lack of access to resources is also to blame. Curbelo says not feeling supported can make victims put off getting help.
Accessing that help is really difficult for some people to take that step. At any point, they can change their mind.
So how can we deal with this plague? Caritas is calling on governments to provide victims with access to shelters, hotlines, and to put measures into place that can support workers in informal sectors. Individuals can help too by keeping their eyes open.
There will never be, of course, as you may know, a sign that says human trafficking is going on here, but there's certainly dynamics that should make us feel uncomfortable.
Signs of trouble include living with an employer, being unable to speak with the person alone, scripted or rehearsed answers, acting submissive or fearful, and an employer holding a victim's identity documents.
And building relationships with people that we encounter, from coffee shops to the grocery store, and getting to know their names, their situations, that can be mighty helpful as well.
It is estimated that 40 million people are trafficked every year, but only a small percentage of traffickers ever face prosecution. If you or someone you know is a victim of human trafficking and needs help, call the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 888-373-7888.
I still stand behind the statements. So glad to see that now that it hasn't been quite a year since I think I did that interview, but it's good to see it in retrospect, because I think I was like, oh no, I hope I'm not wrong about anything. So, but again, I did give that caveat that these are just what we think so far. Okay, so community living during the pandemic. Protocol wise, was just central for us to keep survivors in mind. Survivor-centered, survivor-centered, survivor-centered. It's important to tell each other that, to re-emphasize that whenever possible, because that helps everything else fall into place, even in times of a crisis. So balancing government and health mandates and regulations with community living is still difficult. Logistically, at that time, volunteers were sent home. Naturally, volunteers were able to support in other ways. But in terms of safe house staff, including our on-site social worker, she continued to provide psychosocial support without pause to and in person. And so did the host community, the residential aides, the house managers. And even though it was a pandemic, the residents still need our care. So that's why we never paused the vital support that they all offered at any point. So kudos to them. And of course, the women still resided in the safe house. Again, that's something that never changed. And as a no-brainer, the house managers actually were able to provide sanitation equipment wherever it was needed. They posted signs around the house. There was limited social and common room occupancies. So usually anyone could just kind of operate the spaces as usual, but they just limited the amount of people that could be in certain places at certain times. Community hours were amended as well. And I think the biggest challenge to having all of these logistics is that our population, at the end of the day, are adults, and we want to make sure that they feel empowered, and we don't just want to tell them what to do. And at the same time, we do have to balance keeping the safe house safe. But we are happy to report that because of the protocol, we actually had no active cases among residents of COVID-19, which is incredible. But by no means was the pandemic all roses. Living with others has many highs, as you can imagine. If you ever grew up with brothers and sisters, or if you ever spent time in a dorm room in college, interpersonal relationships are certainly meaningful, but they do take work. Then you throw in a pandemic where you have different folks who have different thresholds for following safety protocols. We're sharing bathrooms, kitchens, and communal spaces. Feelings are understandably mixed, and not just from the survivors, but also from the host community, the overnight RAs, the safe house staff, who are of all different ages and health statuses. So learning to coexist during the pandemic certainly was a theme. Also working collaboratively to identify and understand coping mechanisms. A big learning is that during a crisis, staff still need to be trained on trauma-informed care and how others cope with trauma. Detecting signs like hoarding, unusual messiness, anger about something that may seem as trivial as food. Someone from the outside might assume, wow, like, why is this person so messy? Or why is this person getting angry about their food product placement? But when you experience something as traumatic as trafficking, you might not behave in a quote unquote normal way. So we're all human beings, and trauma-informed training shouldn't be paused during a crisis. Sometimes that's actually the time where you need it the most. A trauma-informed training also is about keeping each other accountable as well, the staff accountable, leadership. And so you can't just stop being client-centered because a pandemic hit or because someone behaves in a way that you don't want them to. Some other challenges is that we did have survivors that are undocumented. So there was difficulty in finding sites to test for COVID-19. One did lose their job. Also, housing placements were accepting less applicants as they didn't have movement within their placements. So certainly that's challenging for when the women have finished their stay at LifeWay. But also there was highlights as well. One highlight is that in the middle of mass eviction scare in the country and significant job loss, the women did know that they had some place to stay. So typically a stay in the safe house is about a year, but naturally this expectation was adjusted during the pandemic. Some utilized the time that they weren't in work or in other activities to self-invest, taking on English classes and other opportunities. And since it is PTSD Awareness Month, I wanted to touch briefly on this. PTSD is measured in the safe house upon admission, and each quarter, the increase or decrease in symptoms is a great indication of our ability to provide appropriate services for the survivors. To date, these symptoms fluctuate and are by no means linear. However, each survivor care plan is unique to her healing, and as a result, in a decrease in symptoms. So PTSD was mostly stable for the most part, and it's good to see it hadn't gone up or increased given all of the stressors in the world. As a reminder, post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental health condition that develops following a traumatic event categorized by intrusive thoughts about the incident, recurring distress and anxiety, flashbacks and avoidance of similar situations. And LifeWay is certainly in a unique position to witness the complexities of trauma among the survivors and explore the means to intervene therapeutically to mitigate symptoms of PTSD. With an emphasis on the survivor's needs and LifeWay's clinical team, horticulture therapy is a proven practice. The therapeutic benefits of a garden environment have just been well documented. It has positive effects on survivors of human trafficking, battling mental illness and beyond. LifeWay's horticulture therapy are employed to assist the survivors to learn new skills and to regain those that are lost. One of the benefits of this intervention is improved memory, cognitive abilities, task initiation, language skills, and socialization. And also during this time, we also started up regular yoga sessions, which help disengage the sympathetic fight or flight response, which is typical in overdrive when a person struggles with PTSD. Yoga focuses strongly on the nervous system, which helps with calm, helpful for digestion and orientation to time and space. Also, it helps in keeping present in the moment. Yoga and movement help physically and emotionally as survivors typically feel disconnected to their body. Certain poses allow you to explore the pathway to connection when you learn to feel and trust your physical sensations. So residents report that doing yoga helped them quite tremendously. It helped them to stay calm and stay in the present moment. I'm going to show another video that highlights activities during the time of COVID. This is our arts workshops.
Laughter fills the room as survivors of human trafficking create their own art, a unique form of therapy.
When they come to LifeWay, they are experiencing different forms of trauma. There are times when they have a difficulty expressing themselves verbally.
The next words we're going to write are who we really are.
LifeWay's art expression program helping survivors do just that.
Within minutes, you were able to see that the women were the safe place, and they felt that this was an opportunity for them to be their authentic selves.
Founded by Sister Joan Dauber, LifeWay provides safe housing to women who have been trafficked and information to the public to spread awareness of this modern-day plague.
Then she transitioned to the yellow coloring.
While art therapy has been part of the program at LifeWay for a while, this workshop had some help from a familiar face.
These things aid in travel, escape.
Talitha Kuhman, their Patreon fundraising website, whom Currents News introduced viewers to back in early August. Now we're showing you how they're actually making a difference in the life of survivors. Producer of the initiative, Nikki Frankel, seen here dropping off about $1,000 worth of donated art supplies to the LifeWay Safe House. The donation made possible by artist John Couch, who is a part of the Patreon. He also taught the tutorial the survivors followed for this workshop. The supplies donated by Jerry's Artorama.
It's probably do one more level of white.
Many of these survivors have endured unimaginable horrors. Some haven't been removed from dangerous situations for that long. But in this powerful workshop, LifeWay Network employees began to see a real change, a step towards healing.
I've also witnessed a survivor who is fresh out of her compelling situation, creating a masterpiece, but was unable to share that with everyone, but the work was so incredible.
It helped them process the situation that they were currently in, to think of things in a different way, and also show them that there's other ways of expressing yourself other than verbally.
The survivors found the program to be so helpful that LifeWay has decided to hold similar workshops in the future. On the Upper East Side, Emily Druby, Currents News.
And one of our biggest highlights I saved for last in the Safe House segment of this update, which is the COVID-19 Freedom Fund. So LifeWay established this fund to assist safe housing residents and alumni who are facing financial hardships due to business closures and job loss during the pandemic. For survivors, the money came at a critical time, enabling them to pay for a lot of different things, from phone bills to buying essentials like groceries, hand sanitizers, and disinfectant. One recipient, a participant in the Wings community mentorship program, expressed the feelings of so many, which is that it was wonderful to have a little extra, and it was a big support and relief. Also, it's a beautiful quote that we have on the screen as well. She said, "Thank God my symptoms were not too severe. I was able to stay at home and avoid the emergency department. Today I'm feeling better. Life has come to the new normal. I'm looking for a job as an essential worker with a huge smile on my face. Life is good, and you help make a huge difference in our lives." So greatly appreciate those of you who supported this fund at the time we launched it. And for me, I was brand new to LifeWay actually when the pandemic hit, and I was just really impressed to see that the fund was truly empowering. It allowed the survivors for themselves to determine how they would utilize those funds. So often in my career, I've seen organizations that think that they know better than those that they're serving. And it's a very difficult mentality. It's a very hard mentality. Just because someone has experienced something like trafficking doesn't mean that they don't know what they're doing with their lives. It's not their fault what happened to them. So I was really impressed with LifeWay's decision to allow them to determine how to utilize those funds and respect their decisions. Wings is actually another LifeWay program. It's offered to alumni of LifeWay's Safe House program. And actually we piloted this program during the pandemic. So it started a little bit before, and then the pandemic hit in the middle of it. And so the programming continued online, and essentially it partners the former resident with a mentor, and they meet weekly to go over goals and anything the alumni wants to accomplish. And they meet for a weekly community dinner. And the graduation also took place during the pandemic last summer, and especially taking into consideration just the varying degrees of technical expertise and logging into Zoom and all of those potential complications, it actually ran very smoothly and was a very, very nice ceremony. And I think actually two important outcomes of the program, other than it going successfully itself for what it was. One really nice outcome was that one of the mentors and mentees, they developed a mask business. Actually, I can show you one because I purchased during the pandemic. which is really nice. It just speaks to how fruitful those relationships are. And it's a core part of LifeWay's mission is the establishment of community. And one more outcome from the WINGS program that I wanted to share is this pandemic survival guide, which we'll link in the chat. This is actually available on LifeWay's website, and it was developed by the participants of WINGS and WINGS leadership, because after all, survivors have been going through crisis way before the pandemic, so they know how to cope. And they've experienced coping. So together they developed this wonderful pandemic survival guide that I recommend that you still check out. It's important, if we're going to take care of others and we want to support one another, that we also take care of ourselves. So I hope that in your life, you're able to find something that brings you peace. I truly mean that. And so does the entire team. Okay, and then our last program, education. The education program, as you know, and as you're witnessing live right now, it seeks to raise awareness about human trafficking to the general public, as well as practitioners in different fields. I can speak firsthand that it was very difficult to schedule trainings, but I still outreached and tried to see what was possible. It's still important to conduct trainings. Individuals were still trafficked, and as we talked about, it increased in many different ways. In fact, some survivors of sex trafficking reported that business was mostly as usual in the commercial sex industry. Men were still buying sex. And healthcare workers, counselors, those on the front line and law enforcement, they still interact with survivors of trafficking. So during the pandemic, we were able to do more than 50 trainings, including 5 hospital trainings. We did a virtual screening, and you probably participated in the virtual screening last year of the film 13th, where we talked about the intersectionality of state-imposed trafficking and race. But you also probably participated, and if you didn't this year, you're welcome to this upcoming January for Human Trafficking Awareness Month in our digital campaign called Shed Light Human Trafficking, which aimed to shed light on the truth about human trafficking and shed light on some of the myths and rumors and false statistics. I'm really big on accurate information about human trafficking, since there's a lot of information out there, but we want to make sure it's factual so that we can act in the most informed manner. And as I promised before, I would speak to the Earn It Act, which we decided to support, especially given the times, and to support youth in the digital space. So Earn It Act essentially aims to end a loophole in Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act and holds companies online, like for instance, Facebook, Twitter, Google, liable if they knowingly facilitate child sexual abuse material. So we'll post a link to that. Oh, Catherine already is on it. She posted a link to that. Please do read up on it. And if you have not, reach out to your representative about that bill. I'll come back to it in a second. That's one of our take actions about what you can do to continue to support this groundbreaking work. The first is, if you are part of an organization that's willing to provide meaningful employment and understand that our survivors have different backgrounds, given that they have experienced trafficking, their employment history may not look like everybody else's employment history, but you understand that they deserve an opportunity to get funds for themselves. So if you are able to provide meaningful employment, please do connect with us, and we would be happy to partner if that's possible. Also, please do consider contributing to LifeWay's meaningful work. So we actually wanted to let you know of one critical new ask that we have for the safe house. So when a woman enters one of our safe houses, she is told that her thoughts and feelings are important, as is her physical well-being. And the time at safe house during that year or however long she may stay. It's used to meet her goals during that time. So having access to transportation is vital to allow survivors to attend medical appointments, consultations, and various programs. And we want to make sure they can get to point A to point B. It's very difficult to have them take a bus to another borough and then another train. It's very difficult to support survivors in that way. So this is a very critical ask that we have. Please check out the link that was just posted. And as I mentioned, please do reach out to your reps about Earn It Act. It might not pass in this legislative session, so we'll continue advocating for it. It is important as youth are spending time online that they have a positive experience, that they are not targeted, that they're not pursued, and that companies are actually taking legitimate steps and not just standing aside as they know that children every single day are exploited online. So please do reach out to your rep and explain as a supporter of LifeWay how important this act is. So thank you very much for joining us and being a part of the LifeWay Network community. Thank you for your self-investment during this time and just for trying to combat human trafficking overall, really. So if you don't already follow us on social media, please do. Our handle is on the bottom, and please do sign up for alerts for LifeWay News and more events like this on our website. So I actually don't see any questions on the Q&A, but my email is on the screen. Please take it down. We want to serve as a resource for you for any questions that you may have. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.